Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to say that and wish everybody's having a wonderful day. And that I hope that everybody's having a good summer so far. I know we had a great time the other night doing the drive-in movie. That was a great movie, Soul Surfer, and had some good food. And hope to see some other people there the next time we do another event. Today, I wanted to go over um, a book that not very many people want to dive deep into. It's the Book of Job. It's very depressing, but also at the same time, it's very informative. So, if you got your Bibles, turn to Job chapter 1. I'm going to talk about the background of Job for just a second. So most Christians have used the phrase "the patience of Job," which comes from James chapter 5, verse 11. However, such a description does not do justice to the complexity of the man and his problems. The book divides into two general parts: prose in the prologue, um, Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, and then sorry, Job chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 13, and the epilogue, which is 42 through 7 through 17, and the poetry in between, chapter 3, 1 through 42, 6. Readers often forget the poetic dialogue and hundreds of years of interpretations have focused instead on the pious of Job, of the frame narrative, who preserves and passes the test God allows Satan to administer. Modern biblical scholars have tried to compensate by focusing on the poetical dialogue, where Job has a debate with his four friends. We'll talk about them later, and God about his suffering condition. In the dialogue here, we're less pious Job, who instead of quietly accepting God's treatment for him, as in the prologue, it, he protests his innocence before God, verging a time on the blasphemous and even asking for a semi divine lawyer who could intervene between him and God. Because of the tone of the middle section, scholars tend to focus on the radical Job, perhaps casting him in their own image, while lay readers intuitively recognize the near blasphemous character of the of this dialect of Job, prefer to fix their attention on the frame narrative to understand the book as a whole. Both pre-modern and lay readers have been, excuse me, recognized for the dominance that the frame narrative has for interpreting the book as a whole. The context of this book is this: the book as a whole focuses on two primary questions. Why is there unjust suffering? And should we serve a God that with the thought of reward or retribution? The second raises the question of indifferent righteousness. In other words, do we serve God without reward in mind? The answer to the latter question actually becomes the solution to the former. In other words, the question of the theology here, or the problem of the evil, is never really answered in Job. Instead, the focus shifts to the question of appropriate form of human piety, or how do we react to the situations that we're in. Thus, scholars label the book a, a what's the word I'm looking for? A theoretical or misunderstanding its main intent. In fact, the book could be described as an anti theoretical book. The problem, theodicy. That's that's the word I'm looking, not theoretical. The problem with this theodicy is universal and uh, per, um, is universal and found in both Israelites and ancient Near Eastern wisdom traditions. A favorite theodicy strategy of the Israelites was the doctrine of retribution, in which evil persons suffer. The book of Proverbs assumes the concept to explain suffering and bad fortune. The problem comes when bad things happen to good people. And this is where we get the whole in Jesus' time with the blind man, and the Pharisees and Sadducees ask Jesus, who sinned? Was it him or was it his parents? And that's where we get this from. This serves to challenge the doctrine, and this is what we see in the book of Job. The Assyrian and Babylonian devastations and exile um, give this tension between doctrine and reality. The bad fortunes of the Jews and during this time continue to cause people to question this teaching. The inability of either Job or his four friends, to resolve the problem of this theodicy, and Job repents of his blasphemous questioning, points to the author's conclusion that such debates lead nowhere. Rather, the frame narrative and the divine speeches in chapters 34 through 41 that we're going to get to later on, which represent the voice of the author and are the book's climaxes, attempt to demonstrate that God's way are ultimately mysterious and inaccessible to human reason, and that the focus should be on the question of human piety in the context of such limitations. The reader should endure like Job. Even when circumstances become unbearable, the point of Job is to show the growth of Job's faith. From questioner and almost blasphemer to who humbly submits to God's unknowable purpose. It is impossible to date Job precisely, although the book describes a pre-Mosaic setting, which means that it's most likely in the Abraham era. It was probably written much later. However, the use of the article with the words like Satan and Satan being able to go with God indicates that the book was written prior to Chronicles, a book from the Persian period. Also, the focus of the question of individual piety to Job was typical into this period called the post-telic period, where nationalistic expressions of Jewish identity were seriously limited. And as already pointed out, the difficult times of the post-telic Judah period, a social and historical rationale of the questioning of the doctrine of the retribution, such as we see in Job and Ecclesiastes. So to conclude, the late Persian period looks like the best candidate for dating this book. Job is technically anonymous, as are most of the Old Testament books. The author was certainly a member of the upper class, since at the time of literacy was exclusively for the small minority of society. Approximately 2% of the ancient agrarian societies were part of the governing classes, and 5% would be part of the retainer class, the lower rung of the ancient upper class, the class of which our author would have belonged to. Furthermore, debating about the problem of unjust suffering and different righteousness suits more the activity of an upper class intellectual than a poor peasant. His artistic skill as a poet and a writer is in question, as has been recognized throughout history. The best guess is that the author of the governmental scribe who may have served in the role of a teacher. He needs noting that there are several ancient Near Eastern parallels to Job. The most illuminating is the Babylonian theodicy. I don't know why I have a problem with that word, and concerns a sufferer who goes to a sage uh, for comfort and counsel. A dialogue ensues at the beginning of the sufferer praises the sage for his great wisdom, but complains about his misfortune. The sage answers with the doctrine of retribution. He who waits on his God is protecting angel, has a protecting angel. The humble man who fears his goddess accumulates wealth. The sufferer. Remember, this is how the type of language that Job is using. The sufferer that then supplies instances in the animal and the human world where retribution falters. The sage then answers uh, similarly to the divine speeches of Job. The plan of the gods is remote. Later, he says similarly, the divine mind, like the center of heaven, is remote. Knowledge of it is difficult. The masses do not know it. But finally, the sage gives in and admits that the gods made mortals inherently evil, and they persecute their own. The sufferer then thanks the sage and offers a prayer to his God. May the God who has thrown me off give help. So that leads us into Job chapter 1. So let's read Job chapter 1 real quick. Let me pull that up on my Bible, and we can read it. So turn to Job chapter 1, and let's begin. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to hold feasts for their homes on their birthdays, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements for them to be purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back to and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and your daughters were feasting and drinking wine and at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I am from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Now, the book of Job opens up in chapter 1. The book opens up by introducing us to the character of Job, a man from the East who excels all his contemporaries in righteousness, like in Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. He is identified as a non-Israelite, and this may be both because of the setting that Job is presumed to be in, and because the Eastern sages were renowned for their wisdom. Verses 1 through 5 starts off with, "The best guess is that Uz is in a desert region east of the Palestine, perhaps in Edom or northern Transjordan area." Fearing God is a typical way that wisdom literature expresses the ideal form of the piety. The call to fear God is the motto of the book of Proverbs and forms the inclusion in that work. The point of verse 1 is not that Job is absolutely sinless. Verse 1, but that among his peers he is exceptionally pious. I think I'm saying that word right. In addition to his piety, according to verse 2, he has the perfect number of sons, 7, and 3 daughters, brings his number up to another significant Hebrew number, 10. In verse 3, note the similarity in numbering of the cattle. It is 7,000 plus 3,000. If you look back, sorry, I was reading my notes there. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, which equaled 10,000. And then he had 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys, which is 1,000. All of this suggests that Job is a wealthy, as he is righteous. Wealth is particularly in his particular day was measured in cattle and slaves. Since money did not exist yet, the family's great wealth is indicated in the regular feast held, like it's mentioned in verse 4. The sisters do not own their own homes because their husbands, assuming they are married, as males were the usual landowners. The introduction of Job concludes by noting that he goes beyond the call of duty to ensure that his children's sins are continually atoned for. This serves to confirm his great righteousness. He cares for his children enough that he asks for their sins to be forgiven and sacrifices for them. So in 6 through 12, this section transfers readers to heaven and the instigation of the testing of Job. The term angel literally means son of God. So whenever it says in the book of Job, the sons of God, it's not talking about Jesus. He's talking about the angels here. The members of the divine council of heavenly beings that serve God, the name Satan should be rendered the Satan, or the accuser. This is not necessarily the same person as the devil or Satan in the New Testament. The accuser function among the divine council appears to be a divine spy who investigates what morals do the earth and reports this to the council. Verse 8 states that the second time the virtuous of Job with God's verdict, confirming the author in verse 1, God assumes the role of this proud parent who is pleased with his exemplary sons, Job. In verse 9, the accuser abruptly questions the sincerity of God's exemplary servant by insinuating that Job has an ulterior motive for being so righteous. This is the question of indifferent righteousness. In verse 11, the word curse in Hebrew barak, is actually identical to the word blessed in the previous verse, since the Jewish scribes were probably reluctant to connect directly to the actual words for curse and God himself. They used its antonym. This is actually reflected in our modern words, I blessed him out. As verse 12 makes clear, through technicality, the accuser is the one who directly tests Job. God is ultimately responsible in his permitting of the contest. The section transfers us back to the earth in verse 13 through 22. The section transfers us back to the earth, and the actual testing of Job begins. Verse 14 links the donkey with the oxen because they are carried and plowing implements to the field. Verses 15, the Sabins were people that lived in the area of modern Yemen, in the southwest Arabia area. The Queen of Sheba was from this region. For dramatic effect, the lone surviving servant brings the message from the attack to Job personally. Obviously, one servant had to survive for the news to reach Job in this way. Instead of human-brought catastrophe, natural disaster from God striking Job's household, in verse 16 attributes the fire directly to God. And it says the fire of God and not from Satan. That is, the book of Job does not seek a dualistic solution for the problems it possesses. God cannot avoid responsibility. In verse 17, the clause, while he has yet speaking dramatically, compresses the action of the scene so that the reader feels the effect of the bombardment of catastrophes. In verse 17, the Chaldeans are the Babylonians, since they did not campaign in the region west of the Arabian desert before the 6th century BCE. The mention of them here gives a date before which the book cannot be written, at least in the form we have it. The reference to camels appropriately depicts the caravanning characters of Job as one of the from Edom or a desert region. Verse 19 refers to a mighty wind, a phenomenon often accompanying God's appearance to human beings. For example, in 1 Kings with Elijah, and later on in Job in chapter 38. Again, we see God directly involved in this catastrophe in verse 12. The characteristic responded to the news with mourning rites. Tearing one's robe, and shaving his head were signs of great despair. Job's body language at the first is actually more emotional than his subsequent worship and praise. Verse 21 through 22 concludes this section with two proverbs and a blessing. Naked I will depart should be translated more literally to I will return there, sorry. This does not mean that Job will return to his mother's womb. The statement is a poetic way of expressing a return to a state of pre-existence. Instead of cursing God, Job blesses God this time. And so Job passes the test, and God wins the contest. Verse 22 makes the final resolution clear. That was a lot of information that was given, and I'm sorry if it got really confusing, but next on Sunday it's going to even get more confusing. So guys, I hope that you are buckled down for an emotional roller coaster we have with the book of Job. There's a lot of information to go through and a lot of literacy that we are going to be talking about. So guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Have a good day. Bye-bye.